Hi, um, my name is Carrie, and I am starting a series on the book of James entitled The Wise Christian in a World Gone Mad. The reason I entitled it that way was because the word mad has two meanings. It can mean mad in the sense of out of your mind, or it can be mad in the sense of being angry. I believe that we're in a culture right now that is both angry and out of its mind. And the reason that is because it has thrown godly wisdom to the side and has favored man's wisdom. The problem is that we live in a world that God has created. The book of James is dealing with more than just how to live in this type of world as a Christian, but also how to be a wise Christian in this type of environment. And I think it's extremely critical, especially at this time, as Christians, to learn how to live in a wise way because there's a lot at stake. So let's get started. We all have ideas about how life works. Since the fall, most people think that having possessions of power or privilege is the way they would live. Okay, well, why is that? Well, the one who has these things can avoid suffering. Those who have less are vulnerable to suffering. Many people see possessions, power, and privilege this way because our ideas about reality are rooted in ourselves. We are at the center and we determine what is true based on what we want. And that naturally leads to the rejection of any objective truth in favor of collective force. Here's what I mean. We don't want to believe humanity is accountable to some deity, or accountable to anyone, actually. We'd rather use our influence and force to make everyone comply with what we individually want, really. So, as a result, here's what we believe about reality. All truth is a matter of power. You've heard the saying, history is written by the winners. Well, this is that idea that those who have power write the history or say what's really true about the past or about anything. So, all truth is a matter of power. According to the economic philosophy of Karl Marx, everyone falls into two categories. You have either the oppressed or you have the oppressors. You have the ruling class, you have the working class. These two groups are always in conflict. Life is one big struggle for power. Today, we've taken some of these ideas even further. For instance, we no longer define oppression as acts of subjugation. Now we define oppression as identification with any dominant group. In other words, oppression isn't rooted in what we do, but in what group we are identified with. Here's an example of that. Christianity is considered a dominant religious viewpoint in our Western culture. So, those who identify as Christians are by nature oppressors. They act on that oppression whenever they disagree with any different religious viewpoint. That's a minority. So, by this idea, oppression or dominant culture can only be defeated by economic and political means. So, here's how this plays out in our culture. We have a lack of distinction between behavior and identity now. The oppressed are any minority, racial, sexual, philosophical, or religious group. We cannot differentiate behavior from identification. We've lost that. It also leads to religious pluralism. It's wrong to say that your beliefs are right or uh, better than any other belief system. That's considered oppressive. Therefore, all religions are considered of equal good and equally true. This eventually leads to lack of civil discourse. Why is that? Well, if all life is a struggle between the oppressors and oppressed groups, there's no room for listening. It's just a matter of power. Also, the problem of relative morality. Since everything is a matter of power, saying that one morality is the right morality to have is in itself oppressive, an idea. Therefore, all morality must be relative. Okay, that's a lot to consider. And James kind of deals with okay, regardless, how should we think? Well, James was written in during the early spread of Christianity around AD 48, after Stephen was martyred. During this time, the Jewish disciples of Jesus started to spread the message wherever they went, and some even began sharing with Gentiles. But they were not treated warmly by everyone. In some cases, they were ridiculed or unjustly treated. At some point, James, the brother of Jesus, eventually witnessed the risen Christ, and he himself became a believer. In a very short time, became very influential in the church. I could kind of see how that can happen. I suggest you read the whole letter. You could pretty much read the letter in one sitting. But when you read the letter, notice that James is concerned that his readers will start to naturally think like everyone else. In this culture, in this world, it's easy to fall into what everybody else thinks. And that is that power and influence is what makes life work. Some believers might even be tempted to identify with the world. If you get a chance to download the outline, please do so to help you follow along with James' line of thinking. But let's just go through really quickly here. James deals with the issue of how to think and act when life gets hard, practicing genuine faith. We look at how mere talk is kind of deceptive. But true wisdom is putting into practice what we've been taught and then actually doing that. So rather than acting according to how the world acts, let's act according to true godly wisdom. So James moves on. You know what the problem is? The problem is your desire. Your desire is getting in the way. You desire to be friends with the world more than you want to be friends with God. Being friends with the world makes us enemies with God. And we just can't have it both ways. That's a double-minded way to think. You know, the Spirit desires that our whole selves, not just part of ourselves. So the answer to that is to be humble. Humble yourselves. Put away your double-mindedness. Don't envy the wicked or hate them. Let God deal with them and let God help you. And as James moves on, you're to put your hope in God. Why or how? Well, you do it by doing His will among His people. That's kind of how the flow is for the book of James. We'll talk more in detail as we go along. So, the overall message of James: how to think and act like a Christian in a culture that doesn't respect it. James is concerned that these Jewish believers will forget their mission and purpose. They may be tempted to go back into thinking like everyone else or desire to seek acceptance from the world. He wants them to be in the right frame of mind and live out their faith with each other in a hostile culture. So, what does this have to do with us? In our culture, we are just as tempted to think like everyone else, and we are constantly under pressure to be accepted by the world. The world likes you when you agree with it. It sees solutions to problems as a matter of exercising political and social power. We can be accepted by the world when we see things the same way, and we are liked when we try just as hard to be considered righteous by their standards. However, the gospel says that no one is good enough or can be good enough on their own. The root problem is human sin, not group identity. And sin is the result of turning away from God. Therefore, God's wrath is on all the rebellious. That includes us as well. We are all deserving of hell. The solution is Jesus, not political or social power, not even identifying with a particular group. James answers the central question for all of us. How now do we live in a culture that increasingly rejects us? Do we either give in or fight for more power and influence like everyone else? There's a third alternative. Trust God. We need to do two things to set our minds correctly: by honoring and celebrating perseverance more than pleasure. Understand that there's more to life than acquiring possessions, power, and influence. Secondly, do what God wants us to do, which is to persevere. Avoid distractions. Stay humble. Keep going. And as Bren has been saying in his lessons, never give up.